August 1943, Pearl Harbor. Chester Nimitz picks up a telephone. He does not call Washington. He does not request another meeting with the Bureau of Ordnance, the men who built the weapon that keeps failing his crews in combat. He calls the submarine base and gives an order that sounds insane on paper. Load live torpedoes onto a boat. Take it out to Kahului Island. Fire them into the underwater cliff face. Not at a warship, at solid rock. The idea is simple, and almost nobody in 13 years of production had thought to try it. Fire the weapon at full speed into something that will not sink, then send divers down to recover whatever did not explode. Cut it open. Find out what 13 years of paperwork never could. For 21 months, American submarine commanders had come home from patrol and written the same report. The torpedo ran true. It struck the hull. It did not detonate. For 21 months, the answer from Washington never changed. The fault is with the crews, not the weapon. Nimitz had been one of those crews once, in boats just like theirs, in waters just like these. He knew exactly what that silence sounded like from the inside, and he was done asking politely. What the divers pulled off that ocean floor would rewrite the rest of the Pacific War. July 7, 1908. Batangas Harbor, the Philippines. A young ensign named Chester Nimitz stands on the bridge of the destroyer USS Decatur and watches the water go from deep to shallow faster than his charts said it would. He had not checked the tide tables closely enough. The ship runs aground on a mudbank and settles there, hard and motionless, while the tide keeps falling around her hull. No one is hurt, no one dies. A small steamer pulls the Decatur free the next morning, and the damage turns out to be minor. A scraped keel, nothing that keeps her out of service for long. But the United States Navy does not measure these things only by the damage done. It measures them by what they reveal about the officer in command, and what this reveals, in the Navy's judgment, is an ensign who was not paying close enough attention. The tropical night presses close around the stranded ship. The harbor sits still and warm, the water lapping quietly against a hull that should be moving, and is not. Nimitz stands his watch through the hours that follow, feeling the tide keep falling beneath a deck that has nowhere left to go, learning early and painfully the particular weight of a mistake that cannot be undone by effort, only waited out until the water comes back. The Navy convenes a court-martial. Nimitz is found guilty of neglect of duty. He is 23 years old, and he receives a letter of reprimand that will follow him for the rest of his career, a permanent mark in a file that never forgets. Most young officers who make a mistake this early never fully outrun it. Some don't try. They accept quiet postings, safe assignments, careers that plateau early and stay there. Washington sends Nimitz to submarines. In 1908, that decision is not a compliment. Submarine duty is where the Navy sends officers it has not yet decided what to do with. The boats themselves are called pig boats, and the name is not affectionate. They are cramped, loud, and reek constantly of gasoline fumes trapped inside a sealed metal hull. The engines demand attention every minute they run and punish carelessness with fire or asphyxiation. When the boats dive, the hull groans under pressure in ways a man can hear through the steel beneath his boots. The officers who command them are not, as a rule, the officers the Navy is grooming for flag rank. This is a parking lot for careers, not a launching pad. A crew of a dozen men or so lives inside a hull barely wide enough for two of them to pass shoulder to shoulder. There is no room reserved for privacy, and none reserved for comfort. Bunks fold down between machinery that never stops radiating heat. The air itself is a hazard, thick with gasoline vapor that a stray spark can turn lethal in an instant, and more than one early submariner is carried out unconscious from fumes that gathered too long in a compartment no one thought to ventilate. Surface Navy officers, standing on the clean, open decks of cruisers and battleships, regard the men who volunteer for this duty with a mixture of pity and faint suspicion, as though something about a man that would choose to serve inside a submerged steel tube says something unflattering about his judgment. Nimitz does not complain. He does not treat the assignment as a punishment. even though everyone around him understands that it is one. He treats it as an education instead. He learns the machinery of these boats until he understands it better than most of the men who built it. When the early submarines run on gasoline engines that fill the hull with fumes and occasionally kill their own crews through carbon monoxide poisoning, Nimitz pushes to convert them to diesel, cleaner burning, less likely to leave a man unconscious at his station. The Navy eventually sends him to study diesel engine design firsthand at the plants building the technology, and he comes back knowing the machinery down to its individual parts, the kind of knowledge that lets a man diagnose a failing engine by the sound of it, rather than by opening the housing and guessing. He writes technical papers on submarine tactics and sends them to the Naval War College, where they are filed carefully and largely ignored. In 1912, he stands in front of a room of senior officers and lectures on what submarines can do in a future war. Most of the men in that room consider the submarine a curiosity, a side project, a distraction from the battleships and the gun lines that naval doctrine has been built around for a century. Nimitz is not confused about what he has learned. He has spent years inside these boats. He has felt what happens when a vessel disappears beneath the surface, closes on a target unseen, and vanishes again before anyone above the waterline knows where the shot came from. He understands something that will not become obvious to the rest of the Navy for another 3 decades. An empire that depends on ships to move oil and ore and food and steel across thousands of miles of open ocean has a throat, and a submarine is the hand that closes around it. That lesson sits quietly in him for 30 years. December 31st, 1941. Pearl Harbor. 8 o'clock in the morning. The ceremony to install a new Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet is supposed to take place on the deck of a battleship. That is tradition. That is how the Navy marks the handing over of its greatest command in the Pacific. There is no undamaged battleship available. The USS Arizona sits 27 feet below the surface of the harbor, with more than 1,000 of her crew still inside her. The Oklahoma has capsized and has not been righted. The West Virginia, the California, the Nevada, all sunk or beached in the 24 hours that followed the Japanese attack 4 weeks earlier. The harbor itself is still black with oil, not as a figure of speech but as a physical fact, a slick that spread from the burning ships and has not fully cleared the surface of the water. It clings to the hulls of the salvage boats working around the wrecks. It coats the pilings along the docks. Men who spend their days out on the harbor come back ashore with it soaked into their boots and their sleeves, a smell that does not wash out easily and that will stay associated with this place for the rest of their lives. So the ceremony happens instead on the deck of a submarine, USS Grayling. Nimitz later tells people this was simply a matter of circumstance, that no other deck was available. That may be true. It is also true that the man now assuming command of the entire Pacific Fleet learned everything he knows about undersea warfare from the inside of a hull just like this one. He steps off the launch onto the dock. The officers waiting for him are not smiling. They know exactly what the fleet looks like now because they have spent 4 weeks pulling bodies and wreckage out of the water. 3 carriers at sea, a handful of cruisers, a submarine force that has not yet fired a single torpedo in anger against the nation that did this to them. Nimitz looks at the wreckage. He looks at where the Arizona went down. He looks at the Oklahoma, her hull still showing above the waterline. He does not linger there long. Then he turns to his staff and says 2 words. Get to work. He does not go to the battleships first. He does not walk the airfields or tour the fuel depots or inspect the dry docks still working around the clock to raise what can be raised. He goes to the submarine base. He walks through the boats the way a man walks through a house he grew up in, with knowledge that lives in his hands and his feet, not just his head. He knows what these hulls sound like when something is wrong. He knows what a gauge means when it reads incorrectly. He knows the smell of a boat that is ready for sea and the smell of one that is not. He runs a hand along a valve wheel the way another man might run a hand along a door frame he has passed through 1,000 times. without needing to look down to find it. The officers accompanying him have spent their careers on the surface, on decks that stay above the waterline, and hulls that do not groan under pressure. Watching him move through the submarine without hesitation, they understand without being told that this man has been here before, in ways they have not, and that the fleet now answers to someone who will not need the details explained to him twice. On December 7, the same day the bombs fell, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark issued an order for unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Every Japanese vessel in the Pacific becomes a legitimate target, no warning required. Nimitz inherits that order, and he makes it the spine of everything he does next. The submarines go to sea. The first patrol reports come back within weeks, and nearly all of them say the same thing in different words. The approach was good. The firing solution was good. The torpedo ran true and struck the target exactly where it was aimed. And then nothing happened. No explosion, no flash, no column of water and fire rising off the hull of a Japanese freighter or tanker or warship. Just the sound of metal striking metal, and then silence, and then the target sailing on as if nothing had touched it at all. Nimitz reads these reports one after another at his desk at Pearl Harbor. He has spent 30 years believing that the submarine is the weapon that can choke an island empire that lives and dies by what its ships can carry across open water. He commands that weapon now, at the exact moment the nation needs it most, and it is not working. Each report is written in the flat, procedural language the Navy trains its officers to use. Bearing, range, angle, spread fired, no distortion of feeling allowed to creep into the record. But Nimitz has stood on the other side of that language. He knows what it costs a young lieutenant to write down that his approach was correct, and his shot was clean, and the enemy ship sailed away untouched anyway, knowing that somewhere above him on the chain of command, someone will read those same words and wonder, quietly, whether the failure was really the torpedoes or the man's. He does not yet know why. He does not yet know how long it will take Washington to admit there is a problem at all. What he knows, sitting at that desk with report after report in front of him, each one describing a perfect shot that produced nothing, is that somewhere between the torpedo tube and the target, something is failing his men. And it is going to keep failing them until someone forces the truth out into the open. Chester Nimitz signs a form. It is a short form, a few lines of typed text on a single page, and the words on it are chosen for their precision rather than their weight. Overdue and presumed lost. That is the phrase. It describes a specific administrative condition. A submarine departs Pearl Harbor or Brisbane or Fremantle on patrol. It does not return on schedule. Radio contact is attempted. There is no response. More attempts follow, spaced out over days, and still nothing comes back across the wire. Eventually enough time passes that the silence itself becomes the answer, and someone types up the form, and it lands on Nimitz's desk, and he signs it. He does not have an aide initial it in his place. He does not push it down the chain to a subordinate and move on to the next piece of paper. He signs every one of them himself, because he understands something about that silence that most men holding his rank do not. He has been below periscope depth. He has heard the sound a pressure hull makes when a boat runs deep, the creak of metal settling under compression, the small groaning adjustments of a hull finding its balance in cold water far below the surface. He has stood in a control room when the boat went quiet and every man at his station froze and watched the gauges, waiting to learn whether the next sound would be the order to surface or the sound of water finding a way in. He knows that silence from the inside. 30 years later, at a desk in Pearl Harbor, reading a form that tells him a boat and its crew are not coming back, he knows exactly what that silence looked like in its final minutes, even though he was not there to hear it. February 1943. USS Grampus leaves Brisbane on her 6th war patrol. She is not a green boat. She has sunk Japanese shipping before. She has survived depth charge attacks and come home to fight again. Her crew, 71 men, know this work the way men know a trade they have practiced under fire. Somewhere in the waters near the Solomon Islands, she goes silent. No distress call. No wreckage ever recovered. No survivors. Weeks pass without a single radio transmission, and in March, the Navy lists USS Grampus as overdue and presumed lost with all hands aboard. The Solomon's chain runs for hundreds of miles through some of the most heavily contested water of the entire war, thick with reefs, narrow straits, and Japanese patrol craft working the same channels a submarine has to use to reach her hunting grounds. It is water that offers no easy place to hide, and no easy road home if something goes wrong. Whatever happened to Grampus happened somewhere inside that stretch of ocean, and it happened in enough silence that no one left alive would ever be able to say exactly where or exactly how. Nimitz signs the form. He does not know if she was caught by a Japanese destroyer or hit by a depth charge pattern that found her by chance, or lost to some mechanical failure in water too deep for anyone to ever bring back an answer. What he does know is the number 71, and he knows that on every patrol Grampus ever ran, on every dive and every approach and every shot lined up through her periscope, her crew loaded and fired the Mark 14 torpedo. Grampus is not an exception. Through 1942, the Pacific Submarine Force loses 7 boats. 7 times Nimitz signs the form. Some are lost to enemy action in waters the Navy itself sent them into. Some vanish with no witness left to describe what happened in the final hour. And on every one of those lost patrols, and on every patrol that came home safely too, the crews carried the same weapon. Across all of 1942, American submarines in the Pacific fire 1,442 torpedoes. After the war, when the Navy is finally able to cross-reference its attack claims against captured Japanese shipping records, the number of ships actually sunk in that stretch comes back at 109. 1,442 torpedoes fired. 109 ships sunk. In a war that Nimitz is directing specifically as a campaign to sever the sea lanes, keeping the Japanese Empire fed with oil and ore and rice, those numbers describe something close to failure. Japan is an island nation fighting a war that spans a third of the globe, and almost nothing that keeps its war machine running. Not the oil for its warships, not the ore for its steel mills, not the rice that feeds the men working its factories, is produced on the home islands themselves. All of it arrives by ship, along sea lanes running from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, up through the South China Sea, to the ports of Japan proper. Cut those sea lanes, and the empire starves from the inside, regardless of how much ground its army still holds across the Pacific. That is the entire premise Nimitz has built his submarine campaign around, the lesson he first understood as a young officer inside a pig boat 30 years earlier. A strategy resting on that premise cannot survive a weapon that fails 9 times out of 10. He reads the numbers, and he reads the Bureau of Ordnance's replies to every formal complaint filed by a submarine commander who came home from patrol and put the evidence of a failed weapon down in writing through proper channels. The Bureau's answer does not change. Not after the first complaint, not after the 10th, not after the 100th. The fault lies with the crews, not the torpedo. The men. Nimitz was one of those men once. He trained alongside officers, just like the ones filing these reports. He ran the same approaches, worked the same machinery, lived inside the same sealed and pressurized world beneath the surface that they live in now. He knows what it takes to line up a firing solution under pressure, to hold a boat steady while an escort circles overhead, to bring a crew home after a patrol that did not go the way it was supposed to. He does not say publicly what he thinks the Bureau's answer is worth. There is a particular kind of restraint that comes from not yet having proof strong enough to force a fight all the way to the surface. Nimitz carries that restraint to his desk every morning, along with whatever new form is waiting for his signature. In the spring of 1942, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood is commanding the submarine force operating out of Fremantle, Australia, and his commanders are telling him something specific. The torpedoes are running too deep. A shot lined up perfectly on a target is passing harmlessly beneath the hull instead of striking it. Lockwood did not come up through submarines the way Nimitz did, but he has spent enough years around the boats and the men who crew them by 1942 to trust their word over a bureau sitting 8,000 miles away in Washington, a bureau that has never had to ride one of these hulls into contact with the enemy and then explain afterward, to the men who trusted it, why the attack failed anyway. Lockwood takes the complaint to the Bureau of Ordnance through the proper channel. The Bureau's answer is that the torpedo runs exactly where its depth setting tells it to run. There is no defect. Lockwood decides to find out for himself. What he does next is the kind of decision that ends a career if it goes wrong. Without authorization from Washington, and without the Bureau's approval, he orders a live test. On June 20th, 1942, at King George Sound in southern Australia, a fishing net is strung underwater at a carefully measured depth. USS Skipjack fires a spread of Mark 14 torpedoes, each one set to run at 10 feet. The net itself is nothing sophisticated, cargo netting borrowed and strung between anchored points below the surface, the kind of improvised rig no engineering command in Washington would ever authorize on paper. But it does something 13 years of Bureau of Ordnance testing had never managed to do. It gives Lockwood a fixed, physical record of exactly where the torpedo actually traveled, instead of where its own instruments claimed it traveled. When his men haul the net back up onto the deck afterward, the holes torn through the mesh do not require an engineer to interpret them. The holes torn through the net are at 25 feet, not 10, 25. Lockwood reports the finding to the Bureau. The Bureau disagrees with the result. He repeats the test. The result comes back the same. He reports again that the Mark 14 is running roughly 11 feet deeper than its setting, and this time he formally requests that the Bureau run its own equivalent test to verify or refute what his boats have already shown twice. The Bureau resists. Lockwood takes his evidence over the Bureau's head, directly to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, the officer standing above every other admiral in the United States Navy. King reads the material and, in the words of one historian who later studied the episode, lights a blowtorch under the Bureau of Ordnance. On August 1, 1942, the Bureau formally concedes. The Mark 14's depth control mechanism is faulty. The cause, once engineers finally look for it, turns out to be almost embarrassingly mechanical. Years earlier, during a redesign of the torpedo's warhead, engineers had relocated the weapon's depth sensor, the device responsible for reading how deep the torpedo was actually running, from its position near the nose back to a position near the tail. At the tail, moving through the water at speed, the sensor sits inside a pocket of reduced pressure created by the torpedo's own motion through the sea. That pocket tells the sensor the weapon is running shallower than it truly is. In response, the guidance mechanism automatically corrects by driving the torpedo deeper. A torpedo set to run at 15 feet ends up passing beneath its target at 25 or 26 feet instead. It is the kind of error that only makes sense in hindsight. A small design decision made years before the war by engineers focused on an entirely different problem, never once tested against the exact condition it would eventually fail under. Nobody had deliberately built a flawed weapon. Somebody, at some point, had simply never checked, and 13 years passed before anyone thought to ask the question that would have caught it. By the time this fix is ordered, more than 800 Mark 14 torpedoes have already been fired across the Pacific, carrying the flaw inside them. Nimitz watches the results after the correction goes into effect. They improve. They do not improve enough. The Mark 14 carries two separate ways to detonate. The first is a contact trigger. The torpedo strikes the hull directly, the impact fires the detonator, and the warhead goes off against the side of the ship. The second is a magnetic trigger, built into what the Navy calls the Mark 6 exploder. In theory, it is the more devastating of the two by a wide margin. As the torpedo passes beneath a steel hull, it senses the distortion in the Earth's magnetic field created by the mass of metal above it, and at the calculated moment, it detonates not against the side of the ship, but directly beneath the keel. A hull hit tears an opening in the side. A keel hit breaks the ship's spine. A vessel struck under the keel does not slowly flood and list. It breaks in half and goes down within minutes. On paper, the Mark VI is the most lethal torpedo exploder any Navy has ever put to sea. In the tropical latitudes of the Pacific, thousands of miles from the magnetic poles the mechanism was calibrated against, the Earth's magnetic field is weaker than the conditions it was designed for. The exploder fires early, sometimes far short of the target, a loud, premature blast in open water that alerts every escort within 5 miles and accomplishes nothing. Or it does not fire at all. Commanders who line up what should be a point-blank shot watch the water erupt in a plume hundreds of yards short of the hull, the exploder triggered by nothing more than the Earth's own faint magnetic signature, reading differently this close to the equator than it did back on the test range in Rhode Island, where the mechanism was calibrated. The blast accomplishes nothing except announcing the submarine's exact position to every escort within earshot, and a submarine that has just given away its position has only minutes to go deep and run silent before the depth charges start falling in earnest. Submarine commanders begin disabling the magnetic feature themselves, quietly, without orders and without informing anyone above them in the chain of command. Their reasoning is simple and, it turns out, correct. A contact detonation that has some chance of working is worth more than a magnetic detonation that almost certainly will not. The first to do this is Captain Tyrell Jacobs, commanding USS Sargo on the very first war patrol of the Pacific submarine campaign, in December 1941, only days after Pearl Harbor. He disables the Mark VI on his own authority, with no one's permission, after watching shot after shot fail against targets he had every reason to expect to sink. For doing it, he runs into what Navy records at the time describe only as considerable difficulty, a phrase that carries more weight than its blandness suggests, coming from a service that expects its officers to follow procedure even when procedure is getting men killed. A man who went around a broken system to give his crew a better chance is treated, at least for a while, as a man who broke the rules rather than a man who saved lives. He was right, and it costs him regardless. By 1943, what began as one captain's quiet workaround has spread unofficially across much of the submarine force. Nimitz learns what his commanders have been doing. He does not discipline them. He reads their patrol reports, and he understands exactly why they made the choice they made. On June 24, 1943, as Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, he issues a direct written order. Deactivate all magnetic exploders on all Pacific Fleet submarines. The Bureau of Ordnance sends back a formal request asking him to explain his reasoning. Nimitz's reply is one sentence. His decision is final. The Bureau notes its disagreement for the official record. The order stands regardless. And still, even with the depth fixed and the magnetic exploder disabled, the duds continue. 2 defects identified. 2 fixes ordered. 20 months of war fought with a weapon that still too often fails at the one moment it is supposed to work. July 24, 1943. USS Tenosa, somewhere in the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Commander Dan Daspit stands at the periscope. In the crosshairs is the Tonan Maru No. 3, a Japanese fleet tanker of 19,000 tons, one of the largest tankers in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. She has no escort. She is not zigzagging. She is running at 13 knots in open water, loaded with fuel, moving from Palau toward Truk. Codebreakers had flagged her position, and Daspit has been closing on her since before dawn. A target like this does not come along often. Most of what a submarine hunts in these waters is smaller, faster, harder to catch and easier to lose. A fleet tanker of this size, unescorted and running a predictable course, is the kind of prize a commander might see once in an entire war, if he is fortunate enough to see it at all. Daspit knows exactly what a shot like this is worth to the men above him and to the war effort as a whole, and he knows exactly how carefully it has to be handled to convert the opportunity into a sunk ship instead of a story about the one that got away. He works the approach carefully, runs the firing solution, and sends a spread of 4 torpedoes toward her hull. The sonar man tracks all 4 running true. 4 hits, 0 explosions. The tanker turns away and increases speed, and Daspit gives chase through the night, hour after hour of maneuvering to regain position. By the following morning he is back in range, though the angle this time is awkward, coming in from the starboard quarter rather than the clean textbook approach he trained for years to execute. There is no time left to maneuver into a better position without losing the target altogether, so he takes the shot he has rather than the shot he wants. He fires 2 torpedoes. Both strike. Both explode, tearing into the tanker's engine room. She loses power, coasts to a stop, and begins settling low by the stern. She does not sink. Daspit now has exactly what every submarine commander spends a career preparing for: a stationary target at point-blank range, a perfect attack position, 90 degrees off the beam, textbook angle. He fires 1 torpedo. Silence. He repositions Tenosa and fires again. Silence. Between each shot, his torpedo men pull the next weapon from the rack and inspect it end to end before it goes into the tube, checking every fitting, every gauge, every visible seam. There is nothing to find. Everyone comes back certified in perfect working order. The crew has gone quiet by now, the kind of quiet that settles over a boat when men who trust their equipment start to wonder, without saying so out loud, whether the equipment deserves that trust. Daspit fires again. The torpedo runs straight and true. The sonar man calls a clean track. The impact reads as solid. Silence. He fires again. This one glances off the hull and leaps clear of the water more than 100 feet past the tanker's stern. Daspit writes it into his log almost exactly as he sees it happen. I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this. He fires again. Silence. He fires again. Silence. A Japanese destroyer appears on the horizon, closing toward the crippled tanker, and the calculation on Tenosa's bridge changes in an instant. Every extra minute spent lining up a perfect shot is a minute closer to depth charges falling on their own hull instead. Daspit fires 2 final stern shots as Tenosa dives for safety. Both strike the hull. Neither explodes. 15 torpedoes fired in total. 13 direct hits. 2 explosions, both from the awkward, imperfect angles fired during the desperate nighttime chase, before Daspit ever had the luxury of a clean shot. Every torpedo fired from the ideal 90-degree position. Once the target was dead in the water and there was no pressure left on the clock, comes back silent. No commander anywhere in the Pacific Submarine Force has ever assembled a dataset quite like this one. A single stationary tanker turned into an unintentional laboratory. Shot after shot recorded against the exact same target, under the exact same unchanging conditions. 1 torpedo remains in Tenosa's racks. Daspit does not fire it. He orders it secured in place. He turns the boat around and sets a course for Pearl Harbor, 2,400 miles away. Every mile of that trip gives him more time to sit with what he has just watched happen, a fully loaded tanker sitting dead in the water while 13 separate opportunities to finish her slipped past unused, not because of anything he or his crew did wrong, but because of something none of them could see or fix from inside the boat. He is not going back to rearm. He is bringing home something no submarine commander has ever returned with before. A torpedo that struck its target and did not go off. And a patrol report that documents, in his own hand, 13 hits and 11 detonation failures against a single stationary tanker that any other weapon would have sent to the bottom in minutes. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood is on the dock at Pearl Harbor when Tenosa comes in. He expects to find a man in a rage. 19,000-ton tankers, he will later write, do not grow on trees. Instead, he finds Daspit almost silent, handing over the patrol report without much comment at all, as if the weight of what happened out there has not fully found words yet. The last torpedo, the one Daspit brought home instead of firing, goes straight to the torpedo shop at the submarine base. Technicians take it apart piece by piece. Their finding, when it comes back, is almost worse than a defect would have been. The torpedo is in perfect working order. Nothing broken, nothing miswired. A weapon the shop itself certifies as combat ready, sitting beside a patrol report that documents 13 hits and 11 failures to explode. The gap between those two facts is a question the Bureau of Ordnance has never actually asked, because in 13 years of building this weapon, nobody thought they needed to. The Mark 14 entered production in 1930. The Great Depression gutted the Navy's development budget through the following decade, and the engineers who built the torpedo could not afford to spend live warheads testing it against real steel. Every pre-war test ran at reduced speed, with practice warheads, under controlled conditions designed to protect expensive hardware, rather than to find out what actually happens when 3,000 pounds of torpedo travels through the water at 46 knots and strikes a hull head-on. No live fire test, not one, not in 13 years. Nobody had ever looked. Lockwood brings in Commander Charles Momsen. Momsen's suggestion is almost embarrassingly direct. Take torpedoes out to Kahulaway Island. Fire them at the underwater cliff face at full combat speed. Whatever fails to explode will still be sitting on the ocean floor afterward instead of scattered across a sunk enemy ship. Send divers down. Bring the duds back to a workbench. Cut them open and find out, finally, what happens in the instant of impact. Lockwood agrees. Nimitz approves it. USS Muskellunge is assigned to the test. August 31, 1943. Kahulaway Island, Hawaii. Muskellunge takes position off the cliff face and fires. Some of the torpedoes explode against the rock. Some do not. Divers go down into the water and bring the failures back up. At the same time, back at the torpedo shop in Pearl Harbor, a second test is running in parallel. Torpedoes fitted with dummy warheads are dropped from a crane 90 feet above a steel plate, a height chosen because the impact speed at the bottom of that drop matches the torpedo's own running speed of 46 knots through the water. The plate can be angled to simulate different kinds of hits. When it is set perfectly perpendicular to the falling weapon, the exact 90-degree impact that represents the ideal textbook shot every submarine commander trains for years to execute, 70% of the exploders fail to fire. 70%. The results from the cliff test at Kahulaway confirm it independently. The answer is sitting in the firing pin. When the torpedo strikes a target head-on at full speed, the force of deceleration is greater than the firing pin mechanism was ever designed to absorb. The guide rod's meant to direct the pin toward the primer distort under that load. The pin cannot travel far enough, fast enough, to strike the primer with the force needed to set it off. The detonator simply does not fire. And here is what the test confirms about every single patrol report the Bureau of Ordnance had spent 21 months dismissing. The 2 torpedoes Daspit fired during the desperate nighttime chase, the only 2 out of 15 that actually exploded, struck the Tonin Maru at awkward oblique angles, imperfect hits thrown in under pressure. Every torpedo fired afterward from the ideal 90-degree position, once the tanker was dead in the water, and Daspit had all the time in the world to line up the perfect shot, failed. The better the shot, the more likely the dud. For 21 months, every commander who came home and reported a clean hit with no explosion had been filing, without knowing it, exact proof of this mechanism, and the Bureau had read every one of those reports as evidence against the crew instead. The fix does not come out of Washington. No team of engineers arrives from the Navy Department. No official program is announced. The torpedo shop at the Pearl Harbor submarine base redesigns the firing pin assembly itself, recasting the components in a lighter aluminum alloy that can travel the necessary distance fast enough before the force of impact has time to distort the mechanism around it. Lockwood personally inspects every rebuilt exploder before it is cleared to go back into a War Patrol torpedo. He will not send another crew to sea on a weapon he has not verified himself. September 1943. 21 months after the war's first submarines fired their first torpedoes and watched them fail one after another, American boats leave Pearl Harbor carrying weapons that finally work the way they were always supposed to. What follows over the next 18 months is what Nimitz had believed possible since his first week studying submarines 3 decades earlier, now actually happening at scale. American submarines sink well over 1,000 Japanese merchant ships before the war's end. Japan's oil shipments back to its home islands, according to post-war assessments, collapsed toward almost nothing by late 1944. Japanese pilots finish flight training and then sit on airfields across the Western Pacific with no aviation fuel to put in their aircraft. Warships nearing completion in the shipyards at Kure sit at anchor because there is no fuel to run their engines during sea trials. Factories that once turned raw ore and rubber into artillery shells and aircraft parts slow down and slow again as the freighters that used to feed them stop arriving, because the ocean is no longer safe for the ships Japan's empire had always assumed would simply be there. The single decisive naval battle that Japanese strategy had been built around for 20 years, the clash meant to break American will in one afternoon and force a negotiated peace, never comes. Nimitz never gives the Imperial Japanese Navy the conditions to fight it. The weapon he had trusted from his very first week in command finally does what he always believed it could, 2 years later than it should have. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. USS Missouri sits at anchor. General Douglas MacArthur stands at the microphone on the forward deck and speaks for several minutes about what the moment means for civilization and for the generations still to come. When he finishes, the Japanese delegation steps forward and signs the surrender documents. Then it is Nimitz's turn. He steps to the table, signs with a single pen, and steps back. Someone hands him the pen afterward, and he puts it quietly in his pocket. One correspondent present that day later writes that Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly it would have been easy to miss that he had been there at all. In the weeks that follow, the newspapers fill with photographs of MacArthur, profiles of Halsey, retrospectives on Spruance. Nimitz flies back to Pearl Harbor and takes on one remaining task. He writes his final report on the Pacific War, several hundred pages covering every major campaign from December 1941 to August 1945. He credits the decisions that worked. He explains the operations that succeeded. He notes the failures plainly, but he does not name the individuals responsible for them. There is a number that never appears cleanly in that report. 52 American submarines lost across the Pacific War. Roughly 370 officers and just over 3,100 enlisted men, 3,500 submariners in total, the highest loss rate by percentage of any branch of the United States Armed Forces in the war. Close to a quarter of the men who went out on war patrols never came home. Some of those boats were sunk by Japanese destroyers. Some were lost to depth charges in waters they had been ordered into. Some struck mines they never saw coming. Some disappeared with no witness left to explain what happened in the final hour. And some of them, nobody will ever know exactly how many, went to sea carrying a torpedo the Bureau of Ordnance had certified as reliable, fired it at a target that should have died, and heard nothing back. Nimitz signed the forms for 21 months while the Bureau answered every complaint the same way. He never said in public what he thought that answer was worth. He fired torpedoes into a cliff instead, and found in a matter of days what Washington had failed to find in 13 years of building the weapon in the first place. Chester Nimitz died on February 20th, 1966, at 80 years old, at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay, in rooms provided by the same Navy that had been his home for 60 years. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. The men buried beside him were not placed there by protocol or by rank. They were Raymond Spruance, Richmond Kelly Turner, and Charles Lockwood, the admiral who had fought the Bureau of Ordnance from a desk on the other side of the Pacific, who had helped fire torpedoes into a cliff because Washington would not look for the truth on its own, and who had personally checked every rebuilt exploder before it went back to sea. They arranged it themselves while they were still alive. No announcement, no ceremony staged for cameras. Just the men who had done the work together, resting together, the way they had always preferred to operate while they were alive. If your father served on a submarine in the Pacific, or your grandfather did, here is something worth asking before it is too late to ask it. Did he ever tell you about it? Most men of that generation did not easily, not at the dinner table. But some of them said something once, late at night, or on a long drive, or in the last years of a life when the things they had carried silently for decades finally started finding their way out. If you have a fragment of a story like that, even the name of a boat, even a single detail you only half remember, write it down where someone else can read it. Those men went to sea with weapons that did not work, and they went back out anyway. That is worth remembering on purpose.